Welcome back to Pinkfish Inc. Today I'm going to go over optimization for the double seventh strategy. First, a few words about optimization in general. Some system developers don't like optimization at all. They think it's simply curve fitting and will never work in practice going forward. Other developers may try to optimize every parameter and every combination of parameters and tack on half a dozen different indicators. I personally take a middle ground between these two approaches. I look at optimization as an opportunity, in some cases, to eliminate indicators or variables. I'll also look for stable values, not necessarily the best value available. To this end, I don't try every combination of everything. I focus on one parameter at a time to determine what, if any, value that parameter adds to the strategy. With that said, let's look at the code. So as always, we define a symbol, and then we define our capital start date and end date. So we're going to start at 1900. That's going to get all of the data for the symbol and up to the present day. Again, some system developers don't believe you should include all of the data, but that you should include only part of the data and use the rest of the data for a, quote, forward test. I'm going to use all of the data in this case. We optimize one parameter at a time, so we pick one. We'll start with the period. Now, this is called the double seven strategy because it buys on a 7-day low and sells on a 7-day high. The question is that the best value to use? So we'll try to answer that question. So we set the period to true. The rest of the values are going to be the vanilla values. So, for example, we'll turn off stop loss. We'll turn off the special SMA enhancement that I added for this strategy. And we'll set margin to 1. Looking at the code, and I'll briefly explain how this works, we create a series that will contain the instance of each strategy run. Then we loop through the various values that the parameter can take, and that's given up here. So for optimized period, we'll run through from 2 to 14. And these x's variables get converted to a string. If we go here, we're just looping through all those values from 2 to 14. And since we're optimizing period, we're going to set the option for period to that value. Then we're going to run the strategy using that optimized value, I should say. And these all get stored in the series. So this series will contain all of the instances of the strategy with the value of the period being set at 2 through 14, and that will also serve as the index. So 2 through 14 here. After we run all those instances, we look at the metrics. It's stored in a tuple, and you can put any of the metrics you want here. You can find the metrics in the statistics.py file that you're able to use. Then we run the optimizer summary. We pass in the strategies, which is that series, and the metrics that we're interested in, and we get back a data frame. That data frame is going to show the comparison, how well the strategy did with the day low and day high set to each of these values. And you can compare them They'll be listed in rows here. We also can call this function, which will graph visually. You can see visually how each of these parameters worked out. You just specify the parameter that you're interested in. I find this very helpful to see this graph. After that, we compare it against the benchmark. Just a note about what's going on with this statement here. We're just getting the first strategy instance. And we're comparing it. We're grabbing the start date and end date out of that. That's the only reason for this line here. Then this is a spot where you can, we want to do the comparison to the benchmark with the equity curve. And to do that, we pick one of the values. So we pick 7 in this case, and you can change that to various things to see how it compares to the benchmark. At this point, we want to compare the graph, the equity curve of using the various parameters for that optimization. So we optimize period, and this is a graph of all those periods compared against each other. Now, it's hard to make too much out of this. So you can narrow this down by specifying just a couple of periods, or this is a list, so you can put however many items you want in this list, and that's here. All right, so let's go through. We're going to run this, cell run all. We can see that it's running through. Okay, now we compare, and we can see that for the annual return rate, it looks like we get about the same annual return rate between a 4-day high and about an 11-day high. So I would say, for this 4 through 11, any of these values would work pretty good. Say the same thing for the Sharpe ratio. Around 4 through 11, they all work pretty well. Any of those values would do. However, when we see the max drawdown, we see trouble at 8 and beyond. So I wouldn't say this automatically eliminates this, though. The reason is this didn't show up until the last couple of years. If we ran this strategy through 2019, we don't see that at all. That's because the COVID downturn produced an unusual pullback in stocks, a very quick 30% pull down that we had never seen before, a pull down that fast, a drawdown that fast. So we don't see it here. So there's no way to predict that that was going to happen for the 8-day low. I want to bring up another point about this in a few minutes. But first, I want to return back to looking at all of the data. By the way, you can look at different time frames if you want to do that and see how the strategy perform with different parameter values during different time periods. For example, 5-year or 10-year time periods. So here we have this again. So we run it against the benchmark. Okay. So now I want to talk about this drawdown. So how could we have what if we had chosen 8 as our time period for this optimization? There's no way our backtest would have predicted this. So my suggestions for optimization in order are use an average value. Let's say we want to go 6 through 10. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We split our capital into 20% equal parts. So if we have 10,000 we're investing in this strategy, we put 2,000 into each one of these. Then we'll get an average of these returns. We'll get an average of these Sharpe ratios and an average of these drawdowns. It avoids this really bad behavior that happened starting on the 8-day low, 8-day high. We get some of that, but not all of it. We get some of the good stuff and some of the bad mixed together. It's an average. The next best strategy, I think, is to pick a random value, which is the way I trade because I don't have time to track 5 different investments into the same strategy. So what I do is I'll pick a random value between 6 and 10, for example, and I put all my capital on that particular trade. After that trade ends and I close it out, I pick another random value between 6 and 10, and I keep going forward that way. I think that's the second best approach. It's a good compromise between the average strategy and picking a single value. I would say the next best thing to do after that would be to pick a stable value in the center somewhere. So if we say 4 through 11 is good, then pick 7 or 8 right in the center. And then lastly, I would say picking the best value that back tested. That would be my least favorite way to pick. Because I might have very well picked 8. In fact, if you go back and look at this same data, you probably may have picked 8 as your day to pick. Okay, so now let's say we've settled in on 7 as our best value. Then what I will do is go back to this strategy file where I've placed in the vanilla values. These are the vanilla values. Wait a minute. Okay, I had to restore them to the vanilla values. So these are the vanilla values here, okay? Except margin should be 1. And then I go from here and say, okay, 7 was the best, okay? Just so happens that 7, the vanilla value, is the same as the optimized. So I'll leave that alone. Let's go move on to the next thing we want to optimize, which is the SMA. The SMA is an enhancement that I added to this strategy. So let's set that to true. Set this to false. You can see this run. Bear in mind, 200 essentially cuts off this strategy, this enhancement. So if we look down here at the return, we do get a little boost if we use the SMA. Yeah, we get a boost on these lower SMA values between 20 and about 80. If we look at the Sharpe ratio, it looks enhanced. The best enhancement here is between 60 and, let's say, 90. And also, we see we do worse on the drawdown if we put the SMA too low. So if you want to use this enhancement, I suggest using a value between 60 and 90. So in this case, you could, again, use a randomized version, or you can pick a version. If I was going to pick a value, I would probably pick 70. It seems to be right in the middle. 70 or 75 or 80, I think, would be a good value to pick. So let's say we pick 70. Then I go back to here, and I put 70 in here. All right. I do the same thing, and I find out that 15% turns out to be a good value for the stop loss. So I put that one in. Okay, so now I've got all of my optimized values in. If we want to compare, for example, what kind of boost did we get in the equity curve? Then we can go here and we can set this SMA index. Okay, this is a list and we can put the values we want to compare in here. So I'm going to put that in here and here. I'm going to run this. Okay, so you can visually see now that you do get a boost. If we use that SMA enhancement 70 days, we get this curve, okay, versus this curve. That's because we got into trading a little earlier during big drawdowns when it went through regime change to a bear market. And then it was on its way back to being a bull market. We started getting into trades earlier, and that gave us a boost. Okay, so now that we've got all of our optimizations complete, we can come back here and we can rerun this again, the strategy. And now we have that, we can see how our strategy compares against the benchmark now. Okay? And we see we get an 8.5% return with only a 14% drawdown. At this point, we can decide what kind of leverage we want to use. And it says our conservative leverage will be 2.32. So I'm just going to average that down to 2. And rerun this again. So now I'm done with my optimization. I've decided I'm going to use a 7-day high, 7-day low, 2x margin, a stop loss of 0.15%. And we can see, I can tell you that this stop loss never triggered on this, or we would have seen a statement here, a printout of it, of the stop loss hitting. Okay, so how did this perform? Well, we have a 17% return versus 10%, 28% drawdown, and yeah, that's it. Now, as I said before, I wouldn't actually use a 7-day high, 7-day low. I use a random value between 6 and 10. So I roll the dice. If I get a 6, that's my day low, day high. After that trade completes, I roll the dice again between 6 and 10. So, and let's say I get a 10. So then I use a 10-day low, 10-day high, and I continue on in that fashion. But that's just my preference. I have one more video left to go in this series, and that is the spreadsheet, which you can use for setting up your trades.